address and signed off really big people. And it's really nonsensical in terms of the extent to which they have even explored what the term means, what its implications are for average Muslims, etc., and who they end up holding in that report as sort of the authority. Oftentimes not even talking about So that's kind of, my brief clarification on it. I mean, any follow-up questions? Okay, hopefully that.
Thank you. That was a good explanation. I think that breaking down the fear of that, this is what this is all about, right? We're feeling, since 9/11, this fear and being able to understand these fear pieces of understanding Islam is perfect. So yes.
Anon, I was very interested in when you shared about learning civics in the United States and how that informed your growth as Muslims. For many of us, our understanding of the types of education that occur around the Muslim world comes from 3 cups of tea or things like that. And I was wondering if you could shed some light on what kind of diverse types of education there are. I imagine it varies within a country, region to region. But if you give us an idea of what sort of education that boys and girls are receiving in the Muslim world, how it's similar, how it's different, and how that might compare and contrast with a much more secular education that children will get in the public schools in the United States.
Sure. Obviously, the Muslim world is vast, right? So it's difficult to speak about every single Muslim country, but a couple things, broad things to be kept in mind. Most Muslims are probably getting either a French education or a British education in the Muslim world.
British.
Yeah, right. And it all depends on college, right? It all depends on who the college is. So, you go to North Africa, and it's generally going to be a French education. You go to what's called South Asia, it's going to be a British education. Now, one of the interesting things to keep in mind with that is it's a British or French education that has missed out usually on the last 70 years of development of British education. Right? Just to be frank. So the modes of teaching are really outdated, in my opinion. Right? Now, oftentimes it's very secular education. Right? So if you take a place like Pakistan, for instance, Pakistan has, most kids in Pakistan are probably going to secular schools, either secular government schools, secular private schools, etc. And you are getting a range of education. Some of it is top-notch. I mean, there's schools like Penn, for instance, who have 2 or 3 schools in Pakistan that are feeder schools for Penn. Right? Harvard, same thing. They're producing really top-notch people who take the SATs and blow it out of the water. Part of the problem, though, within this education is that oftentimes they will throw in a course on Islam. Right? They'll just throw in a course on Islam, but it is usually not up to the same standard of the other education they're getting. Right? Because Islam is considered, within the secular education to be like something they kind of have to throw in, but for the most part, just put something together and we'll have the kids memorize it. What ends up happening there is, I think, the education that they're receiving on Islam ends up being really lacking all types of nuance, being completely influenced by, I feel, more puritanical forces, and not giving them a fuller sense of their own religious tradition. Now, when you talk to them about chemistry, math, or even English, I was embarrassed in my visits to Pakistan and some parts of the Muslim world at how little Shakespeare I knew compared to them. Right? That's what they studied, and they memorized, right? It's the old British method of memorization. You also do have, within these countries, madrasas, right? Traditional Islamic religious schools. In places in South Asia and some parts of Southeast Asia, you have madrasas which take students at very young ages and keep them for probably about 8 to 11 years. Right? In the Middle East, you have that, but less so. What's it called? Most religious education seems to occur at a later stage, post sort of high school and a little beyond. Now, the thing with these madrasas as well is oftentimes the way they function is, you will have madrasa in a particular locale. They'll approach parents and say, listen, open up this school. We'll teach your kids religion. We'll give them room and board, so they'll have something to eat and have a place to stay. And we will give you the equivalent of $10 a month stipend. Now, for the mother and father of 6 kids, that's a deal they can't sort of eat in. And so you end up having a lot of kids who go to these madrasas for religious education. But, it's not necessarily the focus. So that's kind of the landscape. Obviously, it's different. Africa has different dynamics. In the Gulf states, there are different dynamics. There's a general trend towards education sort of on the Western model in a lot of parts of the Muslim world. So you have Qatar has developed an entire place called Education City, which all it contains are branches of Cornell, Georgetown University, all the top American universities have branches there that are now educating kids over there. Two of the most impressive universities in the Middle East were established by Americans. American University of Beirut and American University of Cairo, still functioning high levels of education currently. Part of the problem, unfortunately, like the problem here in the U.S., is that really an elite class is able to take advantage of these elite universities due to the price tag. So that's something consistent across most of the world that hopefully over time will be addressed. But there is sort of, Iran. I went to Iran 2.5, 3 years ago for research. And it baffled me as to how interested the average Iranian kid was in getting an education. It was the biggest deal. Trying to come overseas to do it was huge, but even within their country. But part of the issue was competition, price tag, and lack of funds, etc., which I think is consistent. Okay.
Let me just say something about it. I had this book, Islam and Education, and I was really surprised by the following statistic. Maybe you can help me with this. 1-2% of education occurs in the madrasa.
Yeah.
And we hear a very different story because of our neighbors. Mr. Carter, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I think those were very important points. I want to emphasize this issue by madrasas because part of the work that I do here, this question gets asked a lot. And there is, so I want to float what is a public impression that all Muslims are getting educated in madrasas. Okay? So that's a public perception that one has to deal with. Statistically, they're not. Right? Most people who are middle class and upper class, I just take 3 strands, are not getting educated in madrasas. So that's point 1. Point 2, this issue about certain types of madrasas that have become the breeding ground for extremist ideology, philosophy, theology. This is also a very recent 20th century, last half of the 20th century phenomenon. You can go to certain parts of the Northwest Frontier province of Pakistan, where in one corner, in one village, there is the extremist-funded madrasa. Right? Either CIA or Saudi funded. Either CIA or Saudi, or possibly both. Okay? That emerged as a situation that both the CIA and the Saudis funded madrasas during the occupation by the Russians of Afghanistan. Why? Because Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had this brilliant idea that he could use what is a latent response mechanism in the text of the Quran to oppression. We could leverage that and then have all of these young kids be taught that, oh, these commies. And it was a perfect replication of the commie scare. But it was a Catholic scare. A Catholic is one who is a disbeliever. I think that's the term in Arabic, which is very loosely termed disbeliever. I don't want to go into the details of that. But these young kids were fed an exclusivist view about the Russians so that they could grow up. You know who grew up? You know the Muj when Reagan used to call the Mujahideen, he called them what? Freedom fighters. Well, where did their kids go to school? In these madrasas. And you know what their kids are called today? Taliban. Right? So these kids, the Taliban that emerged, basically a decade after the fighting finished, after the Russians took power, these guys emerged, and the Taliban are essentially a massive aberration in terms of their understanding their true intent. Okay? That's not normal. That's not normal. So the problem is that I think a lot of us in America look at the Taliban and think that the education system that gave rise to them is what leads all of the Muslim world. And that is just sheer nonsense. And that's scare tactic. And I invite you, buy some tickets, go to the Muslim world and representing their travel agencies. Go and learn from them, interact. I mean, they are people like you, right? But we have this fear that we think all Muslims are like the Taliban. That's just so I want to understand that.
Thank you. Yes. Gentleman back there?
Hi. I think a lot of the apprehension that non-Muslims.
Can you walk forward a little bit?
Sure. I think a lot of the apprehension that non-Muslims fear or when viewing the Islamic culture is the difference, the disparity between the treatment of men and women. Could you explain the Quranic origins, if there are any, for this disparity in treatment? Could you also talk about whether you agree with it or not? And could you also talk a little bit about the difference between cultural norms in different areas of the world that are Islamic? Like Indonesia has one norm for women, or at least their dress, and as opposed to some of the Middle Eastern areas. So these three things I wonder if you could talk about.
All right, these are like meaty questions, and they're good because usually, the thing is, as someone who's like teaches, these are like entire courses. You know, okay, so yes, the question with regard to men and women in disparity. The first thing let's just start from the standpoint of, do they exist in the Muslim world? Absolutely. Absolutely exist. It's one of the biggest problems in the Muslim world, hands down, is issues with regard to women's rights. I don't even want to go into women's equality, but I want to just talk about basic human rights with regard to women. So this is a huge problem that exists. Causes of it, I would say, among others, there are multiple causes, but certain traditional cultural norms, interpretations of religious doctrine, and then I would say, in addition to that, political and economic circumstances as well. And I can touch on that in a second. From a Quranic standpoint, the Quran considers an absolute spiritual equality between men and women, to the point where when the Quran speaks about the creation of man, and what's it called, talks about, we've created you from a single soul. And so it talks about men and women being created from a single soul. And the idea of even the notion of Eve coming from the rib of Adam, there is a tradition within Islam that says that, but it's actually, the majority view is that that's actually not the case. That Adam and Eve were actually created from the same soul. So from that standpoint, in addition to that, within sort of judgment